Right, so I don't usually post on here, but I need to get this off my chest. This isn't some story I came up with to freak people out. It's real. I'm not looking for sympathy or validation, but if I don't tell someone, I might lose my mind. A few months ago, I was in a bad place. Life was crumbling around me. Job gone, girlfriend gone, and my mom's health wasn't great. I was staying up late, doom scrolling on my laptop, trying to distract myself from the pit my life had become. That's when I stumbled onto this sketchy forum. If you've ever dabbled in the dark web, and I'm not saying you should, you know the vibe, shady listings, cryptic descriptions, and a whole lot of stuff that feels like a scam. But then I saw something that caught my eye. Unveiling the Angelic Code, a book that unlocks divine secrets. The listing was weird. There was no flashy sales pitch, just a short description. Not all angels are what you think. This book will open your eyes to the truth. Warning, not for the faint of heart. I laughed it off at first. Angels, divine secrets. Yeah, sure. But something about it kept nagging at me. Maybe it was the state of my life. I wanted to believe there was something more, something bigger, a way out of this mess. So, like an idiot, I clicked buy now. It wasn't cheap, $300 worth of Bitcoin. I told myself I was just curious, that it was probably some old religious manuscript. If nothing else, I figured I'd get a good laugh. The package arrived 3 days later. That should have been my first red flag. Nothing on the dark web moves that fast. It was a small box, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside was this thin, leather-bound book with no title on the cover. It looked ancient, like something you'd see in an Indiana Jones movie. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't like old paper or leather. It reeked of something metallic and sickly sweet like blood and spoiled meat. I opened it, and the pages were covered in this bizarre language. At first glance, it looked like gibberish, but the longer I stared, the more it started to make sense. I can't explain it, like the words were translating themselves in my head. The first chapter was about the real nature of angels. It said that angels weren't these peaceful, harp-playing beings we see in art. They were warriors, merciless, unrelenting, and bound by a code of obedience to their creator. They didn't care about humans. They weren't here to help us. And then came the rituals. There were instructions, detailed ones, on how to summon an angel for guidance. It involved burning specific herbs, which I didn't have, and chanting a prayer written in the book. The last step was to offer something precious, a lock of hair, a drop of blood, or something personal that carried your essence. It sounded ridiculous, but I was curious. And again, I was desperate. What's the worst that could happen? I didn't have the herbs, so I improvised with some incense I bought at a dollar store. I recited the prayer as best as I could. The words felt heavy in my mouth, like they didn't want to be spoken. For the offering, I pricked my finger with a needle and let a drop of blood fall onto the open page. The moment the blood hit the paper, the room went cold. I'm not talking about a breeze or a draft, I mean cold. My breath fogged up in front of me, and the candle I'd lit flickered violently before snuffing out. I was about to bail when I heard it, a low hum, like the sound of a distant engine. It grew louder and louder until it felt like it was inside my skull. And then, out of nowhere, there was this blinding light. When the light faded, I wasn't alone. Standing in the middle of my living room was something. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall, muscular, with glowing white eyes and wings that stretched nearly to the ceiling. But the longer I looked, the less human it seemed. Its face was too perfect, too symmetrical, like it was carved from stone. And its wings, they weren't soft and feathery like I'd imagined. They looked sharp, like blades, with edges that glinted in the dim light. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my body was frozen. The thing, the angel, looked down at me, its expression cold and unreadable. When it spoke, its voice wasn't a voice at all. It was like a chorus, hundreds of voices speaking in unison, echoing in my head. "You have summoned me," it said. "What do you seek?" I stammered something about wanting guidance, help, anything to fix my life. But it didn't react. It just stared at me, unblinking, like it was studying me. Then it said something that still chills me to the bone. "Your kind is weak, unworthy. You dare summon me for this?" Before I could respond, it moved, faster than anything I've ever seen. 1 second it was across the room, the next it was right in front of me, its face inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating off its skin, and its eyes burned like fire. "You do not understand what you've done," it said. "This is not a game. You have no idea what you've called upon." And then it reached out and touched my forehead. The moment it made contact, my mind was flooded with images, horrible, vivid images. I saw wars, armies of angels slaughtering humans like cattle, cities burning, the sky raining fire, and the screams of thousands echoing in my ears. I saw angels tearing people apart with their bare hands, their faces emotionless as they carried out their tasks. I saw one dragging a woman by her hair, her screams silenced as it drove a blade-like wing through her chest. And then I saw myself. I was lying on the ground, my body broken and bloodied. The angel stood over me, its face still blank, its glowing eyes staring down as if I were nothing. When the visions ended, I collapsed. My head was pounding, my nose bleeding, and my body felt like I'd been hit by a truck. The angel was still there, but its expression had changed. It looked disappointed. "You are weak," it said again. "You are not worthy of salvation." Before I could say anything, it spread its wings and vanished in a burst of light, leaving me alone in the dark. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, things have only gotten worse. I've been having nightmares, vivid ones, of the visions I saw. I wake up screaming, my sheets soaked in sweat, and sometimes there's blood. My nosebleeds have gotten worse, and I've started seeing things, shadows that move when they shouldn't, glowing eyes in the corners of my room. I don't know what I unleashed, but I can feel it watching me. It's waiting for what, I don't know. But here's the thing that scares me the most. The book isn't gone. I burned it, threw it away, even tried drowning it in the river. But every morning it's back on my nightstand, open to the same page. And now, the words aren't in that weird language anymore. They're in English. The message is simple. You have been judged. Prepare yourself. I didn't sleep the night after I saw the book back on my nightstand. I sat there, staring at it, too afraid to touch it, too afraid to look away. Every time I blinked, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows creeping along the walls, the flicker of something just outside my peripheral vision. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. By the time the sun came up, I felt like a zombie. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, and my body felt like it was shutting down. But the book was still there, sitting like it owned the room. I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed it, and the smell hit me again, stronger this time, like rotting meat mixed with burning metal. The pages felt heavier, almost sticky, like they didn't want to move. The writing on the page where it had opened was new. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. The message was short. The second test awaits. Failure is not an option. What test? I didn't sign up for a test. I didn't even know what I was doing when I summoned that thing. I wanted to scream, to rip the book apart, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to let me go. That night, the dreams started again. But this time they were different. I wasn't just watching anymore, I was there. I was standing in a field of ash, the sky above me blackened and churning, like a storm was about to swallow the world. The ground was littered with bodies, some burned beyond recognition, others torn apart in ways that didn't seem possible. Limbs bent the wrong way, faces frozen in screams that looked like they'd been etched into stone. I turned, and the angel was there again, standing just a few feet away. Its wings were slick with something dark, blood maybe, but its face was as blank as ever. It didn't say anything this time. It just raised one hand and pointed. I didn't want to look, but my body wasn't listening to me. I turned, and in the distance, I saw a figure. It was me, or at least it looked like me, same build, same clothes, but the face was wrong. It was twisted, grotesque, with eyes that glowed the same eerie white as the angel's. The other me started walking toward me, and I couldn't move. It got closer and closer until we were face to face. Then it smiled, a wide, toothy grin that stretched too far, like its face was splitting open. Before I could scream, it grabbed my throat, and everything went black. I woke up gasping, clawing at my neck like I was trying to get free. My chest felt like it was on fire, and when I stumbled to the bathroom, I saw bruises forming around my throat. Finger-shaped bruises. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just in my head. Whatever was happening was real, and it wasn't going to stop until what? I had no idea. The book was still there when I got back to my room, open to another page. The writing looked like it had been burned into the paper, jagged and uneven. They are coming, be ready. I don't know why, but I had this overwhelming urge to leave the house. It didn't feel safe anymore, like the walls themselves were closing in. I grabbed my keys and bolted, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I ended up at a crappy diner a few blocks away, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like dishwater, and the waitress calls everyone Hon. It was almost empty, which was fine by me. I found a corner booth and tried to catch my breath. I must have looked like hell because the waitress gave me a concerned look when she brought my coffee. "Rough night?" she asked. I just nodded. That's when I noticed the guy sitting a few tables over. He was staring at me, not just glancing, but full-on staring, like he knew me. His face was pale, almost sickly, and there was something off about his eyes. They weren't glowing like the angels, but they had this emptiness to them, like they weren't really his. I tried to ignore him, but when I looked back a minute later, he was gone. The thing is, I never saw him leave. On my way back to my car, I felt it again, that creeping sensation that someone was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. But when I turned around, the street was empty. When I got home, the front door was wide open. I know I closed it when I left, but it was just hanging there, swinging slightly in the breeze. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but when I stepped inside, everything looked normal. Normal, except for the book. It wasn't on my nightstand anymore. It was sitting in the middle of the living room floor, open to another page. This time the message was longer. They are watching. They will test your resolve. If you falter, there will be no mercy. I slammed the book shut and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and landed face down on the carpet. For a second I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, and for a split second I thought I saw something. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, moving toward me. And then it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the growling, felt the cold breath on the back of my neck. By the time morning came, I was a wreck. I knew I couldn't stay in the house anymore, but when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. It wasn't locked, it just wouldn't budge, like it was glued shut. Even the windows wouldn't move. I was trapped. And that's when the lights went out. It wasn't just the house. Everything outside the windows was pitch black too. I grabbed my phone, but it wouldn't turn on. Nothing worked. The only light in the entire house was coming from the book, which was now glowing faintly, like the pages were on fire from the inside. I didn't want to touch it, but I didn't have a choice. The moment my fingers brushed the cover, the room filled with that same blinding light as before. And then I heard the voice. "You are not ready, but they are here." I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't have time to think. The growling started again, louder this time, and I could feel the floor vibrating beneath me. Something was coming, and I knew there was no running from it. The growling didn't stop. It wasn't just one sound, it was layered, like a pack of animals circling me, their snarls blending into one ominous rumble. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the glow from the book was growing brighter, casting warped shadows that twisted and danced around the room. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from anymore. It was everywhere, vibrating through the walls, the floor, even inside my skull. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I forced myself to move. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a cheap metal lamp, and held it in front of me like a weapon. Not that it would do anything, but I needed to feel like I wasn't completely helpless. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. But as it moved closer, I realized it wasn't a shape, it was a figure. Tall, hunched, with limbs that were too long and a face that didn't seem to belong to anything on this planet. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes, if you could even call them that, were hollow, dark pits that seemed to pull the light in and swallow it whole. It didn't walk, it crawled, its arms bending at unnatural angles as it dragged itself toward me. The growling wasn't coming from its mouth, it didn't even have one. It was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere inside it, like the sound was being forced through its very being. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, every instinct in me screaming to run, but my feet stayed planted. The thing stopped a few feet away from me, its head tilting like it was studying me, and for a moment, everything went silent. No growling, no vibrations, just the sound of my ragged breathing and the blood rushing in my ears, and then it lunged. I don't remember much of what happened next. There was a flash of light, brighter than anything I'd seen before, and the next thing I knew, I was on the floor gasping for air. The thing was gone, but the room felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows on the walls were still moving, even though there was no light to cast them. The book was in my lap, open to yet another page. The words were scrawled in jagged, uneven lines like they'd been scratched into the paper by a claw. You cannot fight them. You can only survive. Prove your worth. I didn't want to read anymore. I slammed the book shut and threw it across the room, but it didn't even hit the ground. It stopped mid-air, hovering for a moment before slowly floating back toward me. I backed away, my chest heaving, but it didn't stop. It landed softly on the floor in front of me, open to the same page. I don't know why, but I started laughing. It wasn't funny, not even close, but something inside me snapped. I was done. Done with the book, done with the angels, done with whatever this nightmare was. I grabbed it, marched to the kitchen, and shoved it into the oven. I cranked the heat as high as it would go and slammed the door shut. For a second I thought it was over. The smell of burning paper filled the air. and I felt a small flicker of relief. But then the growling started again, louder this time, and the oven door flew open with a deafening bang. The book was there, untouched, the pages glowing with that same unholy light. And then my phone started ringing. I hadn't even realized it was working again, but the screen lit up, showing a number I didn't recognize. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something told me I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely swipe to answer, but when I did, the voice on the other end made my blood run cold. "You're running out of time." It wasn't a human voice. It was layered like the angels, but deeper, harsher, filled with something I can only describe as rage. Before I could say anything, the line went dead and the phone screen cracked in my hand. The lights in the house started flickering, and I heard the sound of footsteps upstairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like something was pacing back and forth. I didn't want to go up there, but I didn't have a choice. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until I faced it. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, each step feeling like it might be my last. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time I reached the top, I could see my breath in front of me. The footsteps had stopped, but the door to my bedroom was ajar, a faint light spilling out into the hallway. I pushed the door open, and the first thing I saw was the mirror. It wasn't my reflection staring back at me. It was the other me, the one from my dreams. Its face was still twisted, its eyes glowing with that same eerie light, and it was smiling. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it stood the angel. Its wings were spread wide, the edges dripping with something dark, and its eyes burned with an intensity that made my knees buckle. It didn't say anything, but I could feel its presence in every part of my body, like it was invading my very soul. The other me stepped forward, its grin widening, and for the first time I heard it speak. Its voice was my voice, but distorted, warped into something barely recognizable. "You failed the first test," it said. "There's only one left." Before I could react, the angel raised its hand and the mirror shattered. The shards flew toward me like they had a mind of their own, cutting into my skin, and I fell to the floor, clutching my arms as blood pooled beneath me. When I looked up, they were gone. The angel, the other me, even the light, they'd all vanished. But the book was there, sitting in the center of the room, open to yet another page. The message this time was longer, but I couldn't bring myself to read it. I crawled out of the room, leaving a trail of blood behind me, and collapsed at the top of the stairs. My vision was fading, my body numb, but I could still hear the growling. It was closer now, and I knew, deep down, I wasn't going to survive the night. I woke up on the floor at the top of the stairs. I don't know how long I was out, but when I opened my eyes, the house was silent. No growling, no footsteps, just an eerie, oppressive stillness. My body ached everywhere. The cuts on my arms were still bleeding, staining my shirt and the carpet beneath me. I should have been in a hospital, but I couldn't leave. Not until this was over. The book was gone. I don't know how, but I knew it wasn't in the bedroom anymore. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt worse, like whatever force had been tied to it was now roaming freely, untethered. I dragged myself downstairs, clutching the wall to keep from collapsing. Every step felt like a mile, and the pain in my chest was unbearable, like something was clawing its way out from the inside. When I reached the living room, I froze. The furniture had been pushed to the edges of the room, the coffee table flipped over, and in the center of the floor was a massive symbol burned into the hardwood. It looked like a star, but not the kind you see in movies or on some wannabe Satanist's jacket. This was intricate, detailed, with jagged lines and strange markings running along the edges. and in the center of the star stood a man. At least, I think it was a man. He was tall, dressed in a black suit that looked 100 years old, with a face that was wrong. His skin was too smooth, too pale, and his eyes had no whites, just endless black, like staring into the void. He was smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that made you feel like prey. "You've made quite a mess," he said, his voice calm and smooth, like he was commenting on the weather. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my legs trembling so badly I thought I might collapse. The man tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of bug pinned to a board. "They warned you," he continued, "but you didn't listen. Humans never do." I finally managed to find my voice. Who are you?" He laughed, a low, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "You summoned them, and now you ask who I am? You really are as foolish as they say." Before I could respond, the lights flickered and the growling returned. It wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It was all around me, louder than ever, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. The man's smile widened, and he stepped out of the circle. "They're here," he said simply. The room went dark. Not just dark, but pitch black, like every light in the world had been snuffed out. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, but I could feel the presence of something massive, something ancient and angry closing in around me. And then they appeared. They didn't walk in, they materialized one by one, their forms flickering like a dying flame. There were 3 of them, each taller than the last, their bodies glowing faintly, but not with any light I'd ever seen. It was cold, harsh, and unwelcoming, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed like they were alive. Their wings were enormous, stretching almost to the ceiling, but they weren't beautiful. They were jagged and sharp, the feathers like blades, dripping with something thick and black that sizzled when it hit the floor. They didn't have faces, not really. Where their faces should have been were smooth, featureless surfaces. But their eyes burned, not with fire, but with pure, searing hatred. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. The man in the suit stepped aside, bowing slightly as if in deference. "This one has failed," the angel said, its voice echoing in my head like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "He is unworthy." I backed away, my legs finally moving, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt alive, pulsating like a heartbeat, and the air was so thick I could barely breathe. "Wait!" I shouted, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." The angel raised a hand, and I felt an invisible force slam into me, knocking me to the ground. Pain shot through my body, and I gasped for air, unable to move. "You were given a choice," it said. "You chose poorly." The other 2 angels stepped forward, their wings spreading wide, the black liquid dripping faster now, pooling on the floor. The smell was unbearable, like burning flesh and sulfur, so strong it made my eyes water. "Please," I begged, my voice barely a whisper. "I'll do whatever you want. Just don't." "You will do nothing," the first angel interrupted. "Your fate is sealed." The man in the suit chuckled, a low, mocking sound that made my stomach turn. "It's not so bad," he said, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. "Think of it as an awakening." Before I could respond, the angels moved. They didn't walk or run, they were just there, surrounding me in an instant. Their wings closed in, the blades slicing through the air. And I felt the first cut, a searing pain that tore through my shoulder, then another across my chest. I screamed, the sound raw and primal, but it didn't matter. The angels didn't stop, they didn't even hesitate. Each cut was precise, deliberate, as if they were carving something into me, and the pain was unlike anything I'd ever felt. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I was lying on the floor, blood pooling around me, my vision fading in and out. The angels were gone, and the man in the suit was standing over me, his smile wider than ever. "You've been marked," he said. "Congratulations." I wanted to ask what he meant, but the words wouldn't come. My body felt like it was shutting down, the edges of my vision going black. The last thing I saw before I passed out was the book, lying open on the floor, the words glowing faintly. The final test begins now. When I woke up, I wasn't in my house anymore. At least, it didn't look like my house. The walls were the same color, and the layout was familiar, but everything was wrong. The air was heavy, suffocating, filled with a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The furniture was gone, replaced by twisted, warped shapes that vaguely resembled chairs and tables, but they looked like they'd been pulled from some horrific nightmare. The book was on the floor in front of me, glowing faintly. I wanted to destroy it, to burn it, rip it apart, but I didn't have the strength to move. My entire body ached, and when I looked down, I saw the marks. They weren't just cuts, they were symbols, carved deep into my skin, glowing faintly with the same eerie light as the book. I was too weak to scream, too weak to cry. All I could do was stare at the symbols, feeling the searing pain radiating from them, like they were burning me from the inside out. The growling started again. I didn't even flinch this time. What was the point? Whatever was coming, I couldn't stop it. I was too tired to run, too broken to fight. The shadows in the room started to move, twisting and coiling like living things. They gathered in the center of the room, forming a shape, something tall, hunched, and horrifyingly familiar. It was the thing from before, the one with the two long limbs and the hollow eyes, but this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the shadows, their forms just as twisted, just as wrong. They didn't move like people, they jerked and twitched, their bodies contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. One of them stepped forward, its face inches from mine. Its eyes weren't hollow like the others. They were full of something, hatred, hunger. Its mouth opened, and a sound came out that I can only describe as pure agony, like 100 people screaming at once. I wanted to close my eyes, to look away, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, but all I could do was sit there, waiting for whatever was coming next. The thing reached out, its hand, or what should have been a hand, hovering over my chest. The symbols carved into my skin started to burn, and I screamed, the sound raw and desperate, echoing through the empty house. And then they stopped. The creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the corner of the room like they'd heard something. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, and I felt it before I saw it. The angel. It didn't enter the room so much as it arrived. One moment it wasn't there, and the next it was, towering over everything else, its wings spread wide, the edges dripping with that black, hissing liquid. The creatures shrank back, their growling turning into low whimpers. The angel didn't acknowledge them. Its glowing eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, unrelenting. "You have been marked," it said, its voice echoing in my skull. "You have been chosen." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My body was trembling, the pain from the symbols growing worse with every passing second. The angel stepped closer, its wings brushing against the walls, leaving deep gouges in the twisted material. It knelt in front of me, its face, or what passed for a face, just inches from mine. "Do you understand what you are?" it asked. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "You are nothing," it said. "A vessel, a tool. You have no purpose but to serve." Its hand reached out, pressing against my chest, and I felt a surge of heat, like my entire body was being set on fire from the inside. The symbols carved into my skin began to glow brighter, the pain so intense I thought I might pass out again. "You will carry our mark," it continued. "You will carry our will. And when the time comes, you will fall." The room began to spin, the walls twisting and warping around me. The shadows closed in, the creatures retreating into the darkness, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The angel stood, its wings folding around it, and for a moment I thought it might leave. But then it turned back to me, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "Your suffering has just begun," it said. And then it was gone. I woke up in my bed, the sunlight streaming through the window. For a brief moment I thought it was all a dream, a horrible, vivid nightmare. But then I saw the symbols, still carved into my skin, glowing faintly in the morning light. The book was on my nightstand, open to a blank page. I don't know how much time I have left. The angel's words haunt me every second of every day. I can feel its presence, watching me, waiting for something I don't understand. The symbols burn whenever I'm alone, and the growling never really stops. It's just quieter now, lurking at the edge of my mind. I tried to tell someone once, a friend I hadn't seen in years, but the moment I started explaining, his eyes glazed over and he collapsed, clutching his chest. The paramedics said it was a heart attack, but I know the truth. This isn't just about me anymore. Whatever I've unleashed, it's spreading. If you ever come across a book like this, don't touch it, don't open it, don't read it, and for the love of whatever you believe in, don't summon anything, because once you do, there's no escape, and they're always keeping their eyes on you.